All right, hello everyone. And hello, I already see a number of friends online. Thank you for joining us. I am Erin Delaney. I'm the Leverhulme Professor of Comparative Constitutional Law at UCL and the Director of the Global Center for Constitutional Law. And we are here today to celebrate the publication of an engaging new book, The Entrenchment of Democracy, the Comparative Constitutional Design of Elections, Parties, and Voting, edited by Tom Ginsburg, Aziz and Tarunabh Khaitan. We have two of the three editors here today, and it is my pleasure to introduce them briefly. Aziz is the Frank and Bernice J. Professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Before teaching, he represented civil liberties claimants with the Brennan Center for Justice and worked for the International Crisis Group in Afghanistan, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. His many books and articles include 2018's How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, again written with Tom Ginsburg, unfortunately an evergreen topic in this day. Tarunabh Khaitan is chair of public law at LSE, and previously he was professor of public law and legal theory at Oxford and head of research at the Bonnevero Institute of Human Rights. He's been a visiting professor of law at Chicago, Harvard, NYU, and his research has been cited in over a dozen cases by influential courts, including the Indian Supreme Court, the Canadian Supreme Court, the European Court of Human Rights. I would also like to introduce Yvonne, too, who contributed a chapter to this volume. Yvonne is professor of law and Anne Fleming research professor at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C., and the faculty director of the Center for Transnational Legal Studies in London. We are very grateful to her and the center for hosting us today. In addition to the Center for Transnational Studies, and I want to mention Madhavi Sunter, who's the academic co-director. Thank you again for having us. I would also like to thank the GCDC, my center, as well as LSE and Georgetown Law for sponsoring this event, and a particular thank you to Chris Adams, center manager at the GCDC, and Nina Elton from CTLS for their exceptional administrative support. Those of you online missed the drinks reception, which has been lovely. So the book's principal purpose, as noted in the introduction, is to put political parties and electoral design at the center of comparative constitutional studies. In so doing, the editors make a strong claim that comparative constitutional lawyers have tended to ignore the import of political parties in electoral design, and that political scientists who do study parties or electoral systems often do so without situating them in their broader constitutional context, and thus they overlook critical and more granular legal details. The ambition to bring the scholars of both disciplines into conversation is one that I strongly applaud, and you will see those aims reflected in our panel of commentators. The introduction provides lists and lists and lists of questions that merit scholarly attention, and the 12 subsequent chapters do not, nor, to be fair, could not address all or answer all of the questions presented. So if there are students in the audience or online who are looking for a dissertation topic, look no further. Right? May I direct your attention to the introduction? A trove of questions awaits. The 12 chapters are divided into 3 subsections. The first section situates the challenge of managing democracy through constitutionalism, with authors Sam Zakharoff and Rick Pildes, and Roz Dixon and David Landau drawing on and expanding their own canonical works in the literature, kind of reiterating, adding, and setting the stage. The second section of 5 chapters grapples more explicitly with the constitutionalization of parties from theoretical and empirical perspectives. For example, the chapter by Tarunabh Khaitan, Political Parties and Constitutional Theory, articulates the functions and justifications for an ideal type party, outlining principles for constitutional design to guard against pathologies or pathological parties. The third and final section, also 5 chapters, looks at specific institutions. Aziz Huq's chapter develops the concept of electoral guarantorship by exploring both the role that apex courts play in the constitutional law of parties and elections, and that of guarantor or fourth branch institutions, building on Tarun's work. And Yvonne Tu's chapter, Monarchy and Democracy in Modern Malaysia, assesses a different and yet also ostensibly neutral institution that affects political competition. Rather than courts or fourth branch bodies, she explores the potential and dangers of constitutional monarchy. In addition to the rich set of contributions reflected by our 3 authors today, the book also looks at topics ranging from eternity clauses, a constitutionalized right to vote, the constitutional empowerment of opposition parties in Africa, and constitutional reform by the Cherokee Nation and the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in the United States. So our distinguished commentators have a topical buffet to choose from, and we will now get to it. We will open the session with brief remarks, 10 minutes, from each commentator. I will introduce all 3 of them to open, and then we will be off to the races. Leah Trueblood is fellow and tutor in public law at Worcester College, Oxford. She is also a postdoctoral fellow of the British Academy and an academic affiliate of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights. She authored the 2024 book Referendums as Representative Democracy and a recent Modern Law Review article called Public Functions of Political Parties, which I taught in my Law of Democracy class about 2 weeks ago. It's excellent. Her research was cited in support of the findings of the Independent Commission on Referendums in July 2018. Thank you for being here, Leah. Richard Bellamy, sitting next to her, is professor of political science at UCL and a senior fellow at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. See, interdisciplinarity. Richard's research combines intellectual history, analytical, legal, and political philosophy, and comparative politics. He recently completed co-editing the Cambridge Companion to Constitutional Theory with my UCL Laws colleague, Jeff King, flagging another book launch in the future for you all. And he's currently completing a book for OUP on defending the political constitution to the publisher by May or so, he says. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And finally, Thomas Poole, professor of law at LSE. His research interests include UK constitutional and administrative law, legal and political theory, foreign relations law, constitutional history, law and empire, and the history of political thought. This may be why I see him almost every week at these events, because he is a prolific scholar and also general editor of the Modern Law Review and general editor of Cambridge Studies in Constitutional Law. So following their comments, we will hear from the book's authors. I am 2 minutes ahead of my allocated time, so I am going to give that to the book's authors, not to the commentators. I just want to keep clear where we all stand. All right, Leah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Erin. Erin didn't say my most important role, which is president of the Erin Delaney fan club, my most competitive role. So good evening, everyone, and what a joy and a privilege it is to comment on this excellent book with such a distinguished group of people. And so as Erin says, the book sets out to, quoting from the abstract, offer thematic and regional contributions to understanding how constitutional law shapes electoral democracy, a subject of no contemporary relevance whatsoever. And the authors do a superb job, I think, of completing the task they set for themselves, and I benefited enormously from reading it. So today I'm going to do 3 quick things. I'm going to say something about the book's project. I'm going to explain lots of things I like about it, and then I'm going to push a little bit about what the authors mean by entrenchment. In the second part of my comments, I'm going to draw on Richard and Tom's scholarship, because I think, like all good books, this book caused me to think differently about other scholarship that I've read before, particularly, as I say, the nature of entrenchment. And the third part, then I'm going to offer some questions about the specific chapters and how questions of entrenchment intersect with arguments about that the authors are making. So the punchline point, or the through line of what I want to say today, is I think this book is tremendous. A+, 11 out of 10, provided, ladies and gentlemen, it's volume 1, provided it's volume 1. And I think the authors of the book have offered a compelling, varied account of the rationale, reach, and risks of legal entrenchment. But they've also shown why an account, I think, is neither necessary or sufficient for democratic success, because political entrenchment and legal entrenchment are symbiotic. And I want to talk today a lot about political entrenchment. So again, before starting, I just really want to say again what a fan of the book I was myself. And my mission after this talk is to call CUP and order my advanced copy of Volume 2 to force the authors to write it. And they're the best in the business. These are serious people. None of them are saying legal entrenchment is a panacea, right? None of them are saying that. And I don't see it as the failing of a book, but rather the next step in a project that I wanted to talk about tonight. So the project is admirably and rightly situated in the context Erin talked about, with all the current strains and stresses on democracy we know about. It has a compelling and comprehensive introduction, and then 3 substantive parts, as Erin says. Although, I do always, though, want to stress or offer the thought that I definitely agree that the democracy is in crisis. I do like David Runciman's interrogation to say, well, maybe democracy is always in crisis. Maybe that's just part of what it means for democracy to be democracy, that it has this confidence it stumbles from one crisis to the next. But I certainly agree that there's tremendous strain on democracy today, and the authors are right to respond to it. So these crises, as Erin said, is explained in the first part of the book with 2 chapters. So Isaac and I'm so sorry, Erin's going to correct me. Hildes argue that there's a partisan lockup, particularly in the United States, of control by the majority of minority factions in political parties. And then Dixon and Landau are worried about what they call abuse of constitutional borrowing, which means taking really good ideas about legal entrenchment, for example, voting rights, and turning them against that democratic system, for example, through voter ID laws and suppression. So the second and longest part of the book then tracks this constitutionalization or legal entrenchment as a result, in response to these crises. And some, I think, see this. I think one of the great things about the book is it doesn't offer one theory of entrenchment or one approach to entrenchment. The different chapters push and pull in different directions. I think that's the only way to read Chapter 7 by Daly and Jones, who are concerned that party bans by constitutionalizing parties can actually turn undemocratic parties into martyrs, increasing their success and influence. So I think all the other chapters in the second part, other than Chapter 7, offer a qualified yes to the question of whether legal entrenchment is a good idea. For instance, at page 101, Versteg and Ginsburg offer a caution about their proposals about constitutionalizing parties. They say, I'm quoting, "We find that constitutionalizing democracy is correlated with higher levels of democracy, which is consistent with the idea that constitutional rules on democracy can help protect democracy. But we also add a note of caution. Constitutionalizing democracy gives an important role to courts in that they can act as an umpire over the rules of the democratic game. This might be a democratically enhancing feature when courts are independent, but when courts are captured by the ruling coalition, they can interpret these same provisions in ways that are inconsistent with democracy." And similarly, on the right to vote, Dawood says in Chapter 8, on page 168, that a right to vote does not guarantee that right will be meaningful. But I think she must be a little bit more optimistic than Versteg and Ginsburg, because she concludes her chapter by saying, the reality of elections and voting, even when highly manipulated, may still exert some beneficial constraints on elected autocrats. For this reason, the claim that the right to vote ought to be constitutionalized is normally justifiable. So I take her to be saying a little bit more than some of the other chapters, that constitutionalism runs risks, but those risks are still worth it. And then the third part of a book, as Erin said, turns to a varied set of specific institutions like eternity clauses and the monarchy in Malaysia. And I think those chapters are really helpful in teasing up the strengths and limitations of entrenchment. So there's lots I really love about the book. For a project with eminent American authors and contributors, it tries to move away from the American preoccupations in comparative constitutional law. Similarly, the book is, concerned about judges and courts, but it tries to move away from thinking about only about courts to thinking about the law more generally. But I wonder if I can push what the authors mean by entrenchment. So I think they must be talking only about legal entrenchment, because they say on page 5, Entrenchment is the idea that constitutional norms are typically harder to amend than ordinary law. I'll perhaps say it again because this is going to... Entrenchment is the idea that constitutional norms are typically harder to amend than ordinary law. And I think they must be advocating something like Dixon and Landau say, that they're advocating tiered amendment processes. I think they must not be interested in political entrenchment because they say at page 6, widely shared beliefs or values make it de facto impossible to change constitutions. But that doesn't seem to me like it prevents entrenchment. That seems to me like it's just different kinds of entrenchment. But above all, I disagreed at page 5, where the authors say entrenchment takes certain issues off the table. I don't see it that way. I think entrenchment is the table. And they say, I'm not sure I agree that they say entrenchment is removing issues from ordinary politics. I think entrenchment founds ordinary politics. Entrenchment is what everyone agrees on and allows people to work together. And moreover, I think this entrenchment must be composed of legal and political parts for reasons that Tom and Richard have argued. So turning to Tom and Richard's views, so reading this book, as I say, like all good books, caused me to think differently about what Tom and Richard have said. And Tom's really compellingly argued we need to think about the Janus-faced nature of constitutions, the way in which they're influenced from within and without, and the political and the legal. And the Khaitan chapter does start with the Janus-faced nature of parties. But I think this duality is the helpful starting point in thinking about entrenchment. And similarly, Richard has thought harder than anyone about the limits of courts and the law here as mechanisms of entrenchment. And Richard argues, I think we should be wary of thinking that courts and the law are going to save us, right? They're going to come and save us here. He thinks this, I think, because he ultimately thinks political equality ultimately precedes legal equality, that people are the backstop of the source of authority in a democracy and that they need to show up for their democracy. So I don't know if he's going to push back on this. I think, exactly agree with Richard. I think more what I think Tom thinks, that political and legal equality are symbiotic, and legal rules like voting rights rules help establish and sustain political rights. But political participation is required to sustain political rights as well. But perhaps paradoxically, I've never read a book which more persuaded me that Richard must be right about at least some sense the lexical priority of equality, insofar as the authors of this book have offered us an incredibly helpful legal toolbox. But ultimately, these are tools that are going to be used by people. So I think it's really necessary to think about how political and legal entrenchment work together. So I'm going to just offer some ways that I thought in volume 2 that might be teased out, which I think is present in all the chapters, but could perhaps be teased out. So in chapter 2, Zakharov and Hildes are worried about the fragmentation of parties, and so minority parties controlling majority parties. I just wasn't persuaded that the solutions they offered were going to address that because of political and cultural fragmentation and the gap between, say, urban and rural people. And it didn't seem to me that that was going to address some of the underlying political challenges that people just didn't see themselves in their representatives. Similarly, in their chapter on abuse of constitutional borrowing, the recommendations Dixon and Landau offered looked like political entrenchment to me, or questions of culture and trust. So they're worried about education. They're worried about not saying the system is broken. They're about educating people about how much actually voter ID fraud that there is. In the Khaitan chapter, the purpose of autonomy principle says that parties should have significant autonomy provided they're committed to the purpose being one party of many in a democracy. But the constraint to me, that seems like can only be political. I could go on, but just to say, in Elizabeth Rees's terrific article, she talks about this counterbalance to legal change with the continuity of political identity, which I thought would be worth teasing out in volume 2. And at Debbie, this is the last thing maybe I'll say, the principle of national consensus empowers opposition groups beyond supermajority and other rules, necessitating deliberation, dialogue, and negotiation. So he talks about how this entrenchment can only be sustained through political consensus. And I just want to conclude by talking about 2's excellent chapter on the Malaysian monarchy, which I commend to all of you. And the authors rightly say in the introduction, this opens up new vistas of academic possibility. And I think that's right, because what she invites us to think about is paradoxes about how institutions that don't sort of look democratic command so much trust and democratic legitimacy. So I think it's the right transition. It's the right last chapter to set up a magnificent volume 2. So I'm almost out of time, but I just wanted to say that I didn't want to push too hard on the metaphor of the table, just to say I think I'm worried about people not playing by the rules of the game, but rather tipping the table over altogether. But I think in trying to hold the table in place, the authors have done a great job in giving us lots of tools to help us keep our feet on the ground, and I'm really grateful for their efforts.
I I'm grateful for your effort, which was perfectly timed. So that's a hard act to follow. Richard, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I agree with Leah's appreciative comments on this book, which is practically a who's who of those working on the topic, but it poses a challenge to the commentator. One is that my own thinking on the topic has been informed by much of the prior work. And second, that I doubt I'll be able to raise points that they haven't thought of themselves. Indeed, quite a few of the points that I am going to raise are ones that they explicitly mention, but then reject or at least drop. And I guess some of my commentary will be that maybe they weren't right to do so. So I want to make two broad sets of comments. The first relates to whether legal entrenchment of the democratic system can work, here echoing some of the issues raised by the authors themselves. And second, and relatedly, whether we can ever put sufficient virtue in institutions, legal or political, to be able to overcome its absence in those who operate or live under these institutions. So, Tony King, who was one of the few political scientists in British academia, he was Canadian himself, who wrote on constitutions and took them seriously. In his 2010 book on the British Constitution, says, almost no country with a capital C constitution provides in its constitution for one of the most significant features of any constitutional order, the country's electoral system. And he goes on to enumerate examples of that. So if it was true back then, it's not so true now, as this book testifies. And as a political constitutionalist, I obviously welcome that, given that the aim of my 2007 book was precisely to claim that the electoral competition of parties and their interaction in the legislature are a key element of a political constitutional arrangement in which citizens are governed, gain equal representation in a system involving a balance of power in which the laws whereby we're ruled originate from a process designed to promote hearing the other side, or like Latin tags, aude alterum partem. The problem is that one can specify the value you want a specific political system to promote, but the means to secure them will often vary greatly between political societies over time. In other words, the political system is always going to be particular to historical contingency. After all, the US Constitution embodies state-of-the-art 18th century political science. But features that seemed at the time beneficial, like 2-year terms for members of the House of Representatives, can be, as Tony King for one showed, among the most pernicious elements of that system in hindsight. Now, the authors acknowledge these problems and just having a more flexible entrenchment is inadequately more flexible than you have in the United States. But they note even moderate constitutional rigidity, I'm quoting now, is only as valuable as the substantive merit of the system thereby preserved. And I think those merits are unlikely to be decided, I quote, I think something that Leah pointed out, once and for all, as they said, or even, I think, once for a while in most systems. So there's a worry that we reify certain institutional mechanisms in inappropriate circumstances. I find the Venice Commission is a prime culprit in this respect. For example, their obsession with judicial independence, which doesn't necessarily mean that it is key to the value that they're really concerned with, which is impartiality. So I think we need a value rather than an institution-first approach. And sometimes I found, this perhaps reflects I'm a normative political theorist, of course, that I was looking for what the values really were, and substantive values. And that brings me to my second set of points. The US Constitution is sometimes credited with following David Hume's advice that we assume people are knaves and that we place virtue in institutions and the Constitution. But as, for example, the new public management showed, assuming universal knavery can create that universal knavery and lead citizens to assume more respect of their rules. Meanwhile, no system can be knave-proof, as several of the authors have, in this volume have remarked elsewhere. A distinctive trait of democratic backsliding regimes is a willingness to flout convention and to weaponize constitutional structures to their own advantage. Again, I think we need a value-centered approach that considers the ethical disposition we feel necessary for a democratic political system to work and how that might be incentivized. I used to think that it was a feature of competitive democracy that it selected for able leaders and sanctioned those who lacked the skills and virtues. But certainly contemplating the current set of democratic politicians, it seems a bit of a false illusion. But those I've yet although I don't have myself many bright ideas in this regard, I do think it's an area that requires urgent attention. And again, one that I'm not sure is assisted by legal entrenchment. As the reflection and drawbacks of as their reflection on the drawbacks of militant democracy indicate, it may even backfire. And so here again, I think we need a value first approach, one which emphasizes what it is, what ethical dispositions we expect of politicians, civil servants, and indeed citizens in a democratic society for it to work. And I think politics in the broadest sense of the world, treating one's fellows as democratic equals in campaigning for our policies and politicians, is where we have to start. We have to preach through practice, if you like. And I mean, both as an academic and even more so as a citizen, I find it's hard to know how to do that, but increasingly I feel that it is what we need to do.
Thank you very much. And I will cede, if you are willing, your little bit of extra time back to the authors as well. Thank you. Not to you.
I expected
the floor is yours. You expected nothing less.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. Now, obviously, as everybody's already said, this book could hardly be more timely. It focuses attention on those political elements of constitutional ordering, such as parties, elections, guarantor bodies, like electoral commissions, that are fundamental, yet public lawyers so often either marginalize or simply ignore in their work. But it's also valuable, I think, for the quality and rigor and richness of its method, or perhaps I should say methods, because I think it integrates the volume three different methods really well. First, comparative empirical analysis, I guess, sometimes drawing on quantitative data. Second, jurisdiction-specific case studies, which give a deeper dive, often with an ethnographic slant. And third and finally, empirically informed and thus relatively close to the ground constitutional theory. Each contribution in the volume is consistently high quality, but as if by magic, we've got an exemplar of each method here present in the room. Scripted, could you? Yvonne for case study, Aziz for comparative analysis, and Tarunabh for constitutional theory, of course. I've got a question for each, particular to their contribution, but also that interrogates, I guess, the ambition of the book as a collective endeavor. So first method, first case studies. And this is a particularly successful element of the book. Most of the chapters, the relevant chapters, come towards the end. There's an excellent chapter by Elizabeth Rees from Stanford on the history of American Indian constitutional reform. But I want to focus on Yvonne's chapter on monarchy and democracy in modern Malaysia. This is a really interesting, careful reading of how through a series of interventions in high-stakes political processes, especially concerning government formation, the king, the Agong, assumed a key role, Yvonne tells us, during a period of unprecedented democratic transition and disintegration in modern Malaysia. Now, obviously, this provides yet another example, should we need it, of how constitutional norms and practices exist beyond the written text. Beyond that, Yvonne is unwilling to commit to whether the emergence of the Agon as what she calls a critical actor, at least in times of dislocation, is a good thing for Malaysia, all things considered or not. So on the one hand, on the other. I want to be mean and ask the question, which is both an invitation to reflect on the case study method, I guess, and its particular application in this chapter, as to how generalizable is this unprecedented but not strictly unconstitutional aggrandizing move on the part of the king. Might or ought it to be replicated in some way in other Westminster constitutional monarchies, such as perhaps the UK? If we're advising King Charles now, should we be telling him to gear up for some political action in the not at all unlikely eventuality of political dysfunction? This is incidentally absolutely the territory of that wonderful Mike Bartlett play, King Charles III, exactly charting this and looking altogether precedent as things go on. So that's the first method, case studies. Moving on to the second, comparative analysis, which is perhaps the beating heart of the book, I guess. Certainly most of the contributions fall within this sort of approach. Aziz's excellent chapter is a standard example for me. It casts the evidential net really widely, trying to get sight of a pretty large number of varied examples, particularly with a view of probing the question whether, as he puts it, a robust judicial presence in the constitutional law of parties and elections assists, I guess, in strengthening or consolidating democracy in times of strain. The obvious difficulty, which Aziz immediately latches onto, is that for every example of robust judicial presence helping to protect democracy, you can find a counterexample. His own that appeared in the first page or so relates to Ivory Coast on one hand and Bangladesh on the other. The chapters, aware of this, the chapters' objectives are correspondingly modest, which calls theoretical and analytic ground clearing, but still produces extremely clear and sophisticated taxonomy. Essentially the sorts of things that courts increasingly do, at least under some constitutions, and I guess the variables that relate to whether or not those tasks are at least sometimes successfully accomplished. So again, you've got this sense of, on the one hand, on the other, structuring the substance of the chapter. Or as he puts it at one point in the chapter, a minimal conclusion from the survey is negative. Given the heterogeneity and numerosity of potential disputes, there is unlikely to be a single right answer to the question of when courts should be involved or not in the constitutional regulation of parties and polling. The world is too complex for a single, simple solution of that kind. It's got to be right on one level. But my question to Aziz, as I guess a representative of this method, but it could also be as easily put to any contributor, is this. If you don't think it's these particular variables, constitutional design, features, constitutional rules, legal and institutions, that are really doing the work here, then what is? In other words, are we just scratching the surface here? With all this, very clever, very rigorous work focused on public law structures, while the real stuff, whatever that might be, the stuff that actually makes the difference, takes place more or less outside our field of analytical vision. Which brings us to the third and final message, constitutional theory, and Tarun's substantial and very powerful chapter on political parties in constitutional theory. He identifies wonderfully the values of political parties in democratic will formation, I guess, and translates these values into 4 principles or meta principles that democratic states should optimize in relation to political parties. There's an enormous amount to like here and not much to disagree with. But as Tarun recognizes, the devil's going to be in the detail, which here means constitutional and regulatory design. Now, Tarun is at pains to emphasize first, that constitutionalization doesn't equate to judicialization here. And second, that in general, a cautious approach, as he calls it, which prioritizes political enforcement, self-regulation, nudges and the like, is to be preferred. So as he puts it in one crucial paragraph in the relevant chapter, in constitutional practice, context matters a lot. Even in a given context, there may be many different ways of satisfying the purposive autonomy principle, one of these meta principles I just spoke about. The main point is that instead of trying to fit political parties into a ready-made template designed either for private individuals or for state bodies, an a la carte regulatory framework that works for them is required. Again, we have this repetition on the one hand, on the other hand, I guess, motif. Now, how do we know what precise blend of law and convention, institutional architecture, checks and balances, et cetera, works for us, for this particular community? It's a situated problem, in other words, which looks back. You are where you are. That is downstream of a whole lot of history. That is convention carrying ideas, practice, and habits, but also forward-looking, in that it's extremely hard, as all the other chapters illustrate, precisely where the challenges are going to come from. Not in general terms, we can talk about those, but in specific terms, the ones that are going to affect you and your context, and your case, your nation. Now, this observation might cash out maximally. It feels a bit like, as it were, in tragic mode, if you're adopting Adam Smith's metaphor, a bit like an attempt to arrange the pieces on a chessboard while everybody else is about to enter a bout of ultimate fighting championship, or something like that. Or it might be cashed out or arranged more moderately in the following sense. There's the upsides of regulating, admittedly in a soft touch way, is assumed to stabilize democracy. If you get it right, stabilize democracy. And that's very heavily played up in the chapter, perhaps even assumed as a fairly likely benefit of decent regulatory and constitutional arrangements. But it's not altogether clear that the downside risk of new constitutional design creating instability, or perhaps more obviously making it easier for those inclined to foster instability, is given the same amount of attention. Downside risk in a particular context. So there we have it. 3 contributions, 3 methods, 1 great book.
And beautiful timing. Thank you, because we have a hard stop at 7:20. So we now have gathered more than about 5 minutes each for you to respond to this veritable cornucopia of feedback. Who would like to start?
I'll start because I think that probably makes a little bit of sense, because I think we'll go from specific to broad contributors, then being able to respond to the book's broad themes. First of all, thank you so much to all the commentators and to Erin as the chair, to Tom, Richard, Leah. Like, this has been has been incredibly rich. And a who's who in the UK scene on how to talk about these issues. So I'm very, this has been such a treat. I will say that I feel like my chapter or my contribution, I feel a little bit of an interloper, an outlier on a book that's called The Entrenchment of Democracy, and on the comparative constitutional design of elections, parties, and voting, because my contribution was on neither elections, political parties, or voting. It was on, and I think like this is the intervention, on a kind of a surprising institutional actor that nevertheless played a key role in a political transition. In this case, the case study being, as Tom would said, like a specific country case study of Malaysia, the monarch, the king, the constitutional monarch. And so here we have this non-elected, non-majoritarian institution. Much of comparative constitutional law over the last several decades, I think, has focused a lot on courts, it's focused a lot on political parties, it's focused on questions about non-majoritarian institutions in these contexts. I think the monarchy is this sort of we think of it as an anachronistic institution that probably has no more relevance in the modern world. And then here it is in this context, playing this incredibly vital role in a democratic political transition. So I will turn back to Tom's question. But I just wanted to set the scene. That was kind of how I came into this project. Actually, the editors had asked me whether I would talk about this particular institutional actor, and it actually raised many of the provocations of the book for me in thinking about this. So I just wanted to note what that looked like in the Malaysian context, and then maybe draw a couple of broader questions out of that example for the book project, and then turn it back to the book's questions as a whole, so the commentators' questions. One of the examples I looked at in the book for the audience who may not have, read the chapter with as much care as the people on this panel clearly, one of the examples that I used in the book was, this is 2020. It's just before COVID. We had, for the first time in Malaysia's history, 2 years before that, there had been a transition from a single party, dominant party ruling system to actually a democratic transition. The opposition party had come into power, and then 2 years later, this was all disintegrating. In the midst of this political integration, with all this party hopping by different politicians in this parliamentary system, the king steps into this breach. At this point, it was unclear who the prime minister candidate was going to be out of three vying contenders. And the king, and the constitutional text, and this is on the text versus norms question, says, as it does, following the UK tradition, we are, faithful British, late post-colonial system in Malaysia, says that the king shall appoint as prime minister who in his judgment is likely to command the confidence of the majority of the members of the House. Totally conventional text practice in the past. There had never been any question who commanded the majority in the House when you have a one-party dominant prime minister in place. Now, in this context, given that it was unclear, the king said, I shall now have to exercise my judgment. And there was this incredible process where he said, all the MPs shall come to the palace and I'm going to interview them one by one. And you have a literal trove of MPs walking through the palace for 2 days for this interview with the king, who at the end of it then decides who in his judgment commands the confidence of the majority and appoints the prime minister, not the one who was in a different prime minister, essentially in that process, playing the role in government formation in that context, a critical role that ultimately led to a complete regime change, right? And so this was this unprecedented kind of intervention was what I was thinking of when I was reading through this and trying to link it to some of the book's themes. So a couple ways in which I think it connects to the book's questions would be the book discusses, I think, who or how to structure democratic competition, especially between political parties or constitutional institutions. Here is another constitutional institution that has played a somewhat unprecedented, but arguably within question mark the constitutional text of or general structure, and what is the role for such alternative actors, whether we're thinking about the courts, whether we're thinking about political parties, whether we're thinking about the monarchy, to play a role within these kinds of constitutional contexts, especially perhaps when democratic mechanisms fail. So in this context, one argument from proponents of the king's intervention was the typical political democratic mechanisms were out of joint. They were not operating or functioning as normal. And so into this breach, instead of the courts in this case, this was a monarch who had played a particular role. So I think this raises a couple of questions, which is, one, there's such an enhanced role for these kinds of non-elected, non-majoritarian institutions in these contexts. Does it enhance or undermine sort of democratic integrity in these contexts? Does it help or hinder the entrenchment of democracy, as the editors see it? Because you could tell a narrative on the one hand of the monarch as a stabilizing force that actually helped to bring in a check and balance against a volatile political situation, or you could tell conversely, tell a story of this royal assertiveness as an illegitimate intrusion that kind of went beyond the formal constitutional text and disrupts or at worst overturns the democratic process, and which probably has kind of consequences going forward into the future. The second kind of broad theme that this brings up, of course, is this relationship between constitutional design, which is in the title of the book, and actual constitutional practice. Whereas the matter of constitutional text, one could argue that the king did, appoint who in his judgment commands the confidence of the majority. That is in the constitutional text. It was not done by the typical procedures or practice in which this happens, and arguably went beyond the whatever the framers had put into place this text had thought the monarch's role would play, which I think raises an interesting point of comparison with other places like the UK or other sort of more established democracies, when there's a link between design, where I think in some newer, more emerging constitutional systems, these sort of conventions that have crystallized or entrenched into the practices that have entrenched into constitutional rules or conventions are just it's more flexible in some of these newer systems. There may be more room in these contexts for an institutional actor like the monarch to then expand their power in the exact kind of scenario where there is sort of an influx type, when these constitutional norms are in flux. And so this raises, I think, questions for democratic legitimacy, but also institutional design and how we should think about that as a whole. And so just to kind of like then finish up on thinking about this broader question, these provocations that Tom brought up specifically in his questions, like, well, one, how generalizable is this, right? Well, I think one way to think about it, as we discussed, would be how some of those provocations link with the book's themes and questions about design, etc. in thinking about institutional actors. Leah also helpfully said, and I like this, that this could then push for a volume 2, volume 3, as to like where these kinds of non-elected, non-majority institutions might be. But I do think it raises, if I was going to think about this for myself as a monarchy question, a broader question about a broader project, perhaps. I'm thinking about the roles and functions of monarchs in different comparative contexts. And I think here, as a comparative constitutionalist, it's always really important to be very context sensitive and context attentive, right? And I think you can just thinking broadly, even as a typology, you could think of a couple of roles or functions monarchs might have. The one that I've just talked about in the Malaysian context is a maximalist role for a monarch, where when institution expands its formal power and continues to kind of play a more enhanced, expansive role in constitutional governance, probably far beyond what was originally envisaged for that. You can think of Malaysia here, but I think maybe even contexts like Thailand, like there are kind of some other contexts that I would love to explore more to see where that would go. By contrast, you might think of the second kind of function being a minimalist monarch. Now, this is your classic Queen Elizabeth, Charles, maybe not Charles III, but the version. You see, the power of the monarch is conserved by being minimalist in how the monarchy uses power. The European monarchies, probably Japan and Asia, where the trend has been the other way, right? It's been from powerful monarchs to kind of to be a more sort of minimalist role within the constitutional system, has been the way in which these monarchs have actually reserved or enhanced their position in these constitutional governance. And finally, maybe a third kind of function might be a monarch in a crisis insurance kind of role. So this is what Tom Ginsburg, I think, has called like the stabilizing crisis insurance role in times of crisis. Perhaps in those very specific contexts, a monarch might insert themselves kind of like as the neutral arbiter or neutral institution to try to bring in a kind of stabilizing force in some of these contexts. King Carlos in Spain in 1982 has been brought up as an example before. Other kinds of examples like this. So even just thinking, even as a tentative starting point, the different kind of roles that monarchs might play in different comparative contexts. And over 20% of constitutional democracies around the world are monarchies, in fact. So this is not like a completely anachronistic kind of context. I think raises some questions for us, both for the book, but I think also for the field of comparative constitutional law, that, like that there are all these other kind of interesting fourth branch courts, but also other institutions that we might want to think about that, for better or for worse. And you are right that I do hedge in the chapter normatively what might take it is because I think the ultimate answer then would be, it might depend, and it does depend, I think, on the context in which these monarchs play their role and what that would look like for that particular constitutional democracy. But that chapter was really very much my first point in thinking about these questions both descriptively and normatively. And I will pause here to then make sure that the editors have their full view.
Thank you for this next set of comments from the panel. Very informative. So I'll pick up some of them and leave Aziz to answer the hard ones. Let me start with your reading, Leah. To that, I would say not guilty. The idea that the editors they must be legal entrenchment. Page 5, even when norms are not entrenched legally, political practice can factor entrenchment by including political actors. Right? And this is, I'm not picking out a line out of context. It's just that given the nature of the volume and given how different sorts of scholars Tom, Aziz, and I are, that we could not, I don't think three of us will have the same view on entrenchment anyway, right? So I think, but your pressure point is still very useful for me to at least make a few general comments about entrenchment. I thought we should have had a chapter about entrenchment in a book whose which is called Entrenchment. That's for volume 2, which you are going to edit. The first is that, both the US and the UK define the two outlying poles on this matter, right? Where the rest of the world's practice is very much in between these poles, right? But so much of theorizing happens from these two extreme outliers that it also distorts the scholarly sort of way we think about entrenchment. So I think the political economy of scholarship is important here. I think either type of entrenchment is a matter of degree, right? Given the American rigidity, just think of entrenchment. Yeah, the Indian Constitution is what was the last count? 130 amendments in 70 odd years, right? So it depends on a vast number of factors. Obviously, there are tiered amendment processes. I think the point of entrenchment should not be, we all know from the American context, impossibility to change, right? The question is whether certain rules of the game should be changeable unilaterally by the ruling party. That is a very different question for me, which is why I also think that looking at the entrenchment debate from the rights lens is completely different from looking at it from electoral management and political parties lens, right? Because the rights question and reasonable disagreement and Jeremy Waldron, etc., are thinking about completely different concerns from the concern here, which is should one of the big players in the game, and this is in part a response to you, should one of the big players of the game get to rewrite the rules of the game in the middle of the game, right? And that is a clear question. But as far as I'm concerned, my view of entrenchment is that I don't have a general preference between political or legal entrenchment. I do have views, and to Tom's question, I'll come back to it about what we do in particular context. But so that's the first response is not guilty, and that we do. But the third thing, which I am only beginning to think after this panel as an entrenchment point, is what in the introduction in my chapter we've called second order regulation, right? And I've never thought of that as entrenchment, but I'm increasingly beginning to think maybe we should, right? And for those of you who've not read the book, second order regulation is basically all constitutions, whether in the main text or through statutes, have to have rules about how the game is to be played. Right? They have to decide about the form of government. They have to decide about electoral method, PR, or ranked choice voting, or first past the post, or some combination of that. So silence is not an option. And each of these combinations of regulatory choices has implications for the system. So you're a lot less likely to get anti-system parties in ranked choice voting. You're far more likely to get anti-system parties in proportional representation, hopefully in a minority. Right? First past the post. So I think that these choices, even when they are readily changeable, are entrenching because if you accept my hypothesis at least, that the rules of the game influence the kind of party system we end up with, then they're entrenching because by making it more likely that we are going to get a certain type of party system, they're more likely to preserve the system in place. Whereas systems that are more like PR, which are more likely to create anti-system parties we know from Israel, from Italy, from Germany, once in a while they will come to hold balance of power. Right? And then how much anti-system gains they can extract on the system will depend on the party. So I think we should probably see these choices as a form of entrenchment as well. And that is what I think political scientists, when they talk of path dependencies, are on about, right? That certain choices make it very hard to do other things. Okay, so that's mostly on Leah. Just again, one more thing about political entrenchment is that we have paid so much attention to thinking about the design of legal entrenchment. We've done almost no work on thinking about political entrenchment also being a matter of institutional choices. So the Thai constitution, right, has these sets of constitutional directives which are not judicially enforced, but every new government, when it takes office, has 100 days to produce a plan before the country of how it seeks to enforce it. The Nepali constitution has a standing committee on directorates. We haven't thought about design of political enforcement, right? But as the discipline becomes more interested in the politics of constitution, I think, Richard, I've already answered it a bit. I mean, on knavery or naivety, I think, there's a balance to be struck. I think constitutional makers must think about how will the system cope with bad actors, because given the reality of what human beings are, great people, great, right? But I think it is a problem if we don't. I don't think the design can solve all our problems, but I also don't think that design is irrelevant. Right? And this is sort of a good segue to move to Tom's questions, right? Because one of the autocrats, seem to care about design. Why do they invest so much political capital in changing constitutional design? What do they know that we don't? Right? And I think aligned with that, they just seem to care about hard law. They want to be seen as complying with hard law. They don't care about vague laws, gray zones, ambiguity, soft norms, conventions, but they absolutely care about the hard black letter law, and that maybe rule of law has been too successful, right? But it gives us reasons to think about what's going on here. So while design is not a panacea, while good design can fail and bad design can also thrive, which is why I'm not entirely sure about these correlations between this country has this perfect design and still has this bad system design. Because we often see that as causal relationship, and we often say everything is contextual. Yes, context matters. Design also matters. The one thing we don't think about enough is that individual design problems are designed systemically, how each design feature interacts with other design features of the system. That is hugely important, and that to me is not context. That's design thought of systemically, and that is a different kind of analysis that constitutional scholars need to. And this is also a lawyerly methodological commitment to the particular issue, particular case in front of you, right? So it takes us away from thinking about a more system-based analysis, which I think has been a problem. So, and finally, even though consulting's context maybe is what will determine, we do know a lot in general about certain types of designs. We do know that presidentialism and democratic fragility has an extremely strong connection. It's more than a correlation. The only debate in the scholarship is which ways the causation runs. Right? Do fragile democracies adopt presidentialism, or does presidentialism leads to fragile democracy? We do know that leaving electoral management and boundary allocation to the ruling party is a bad idea. I mean, you don't need to be a design expert to figure that out. So there's certain design, of course, with bad design, certain countries can still thrive. But I think we can be too dismissive of the importance of design when it is one factor. I completely agree. The history, context, path dependency, luck, personalities, leadership, these all things matter. But the tragedy of the human condition is that the design is the only element on which we have any control. And if we're tweaking it, is our best chance.
I want to start off by thanking Erin for her marvelous, as usual, introduction. Leah, Richard, and Tom for their provocative and tremendously thoughtful comments. Let me start by trying to encapsulate, I think, Leah and Richard's comments in one phrase, and Tom's in a second phrase. So, as I understand, or one way of glossing what both Leah and Richard were particularly pressing on is what is the role of the ethical in the preservation or the effort to sustain democracy, and more specifically or pointedly, what's the location of the ethical? Does it reside in the form of text, or does it reside in the form of atextual norms, practices, perhaps dispositions? Right, I will add in a second economic arrangements, which I think are also important, which I was surprised that nobody mentioned. And in a sense, where Tom's question intersects with that is, assume that the ethical in some measure resides in the law, to what extent is the available evidence determinative of the particular formulation that the law should take, right? So I think the one way of understanding the sum of the comments is by tracing this question of the ethical down from one level to another. Okay, I think those are terrific questions. The way that I would approach the questions is by offering maybe more pointed critique of the book than you guys offered, by saying that we didn't offer at the threshold a clear enough self-definition of democracy, and didn't push ourselves or our contributors to clarify when they were using one of two different senses of the term entrenchment. And I think once we offer a definition and clarify the distinction, we make some progress toward offering an answer to your question. Okay, so how would I define democracy, and what are the two senses of the word entrenchment that I would point to as insufficiently clarified in the text? Consider the following as an extremely high-level definition of democracy. Democracy entails the possibility of revisable and defeasible political choices with respect to leaders, choices with respect to policies, on the part of a polity at large in a particular geographic, so revisable and defeasible, ouster at a period of time, right? Notice a couple of things about that definition. The first point is that the definition is itself exceedingly ethically demanding. It requires a very particular kind of epistemic modesty. It requires further a very particular and perhaps often unrealized form of acceptance of alterity, of difference. And one way of taking Richard's points is to say, well, it turns out that those qualities are often absent. Totally fair. Second point, the assumption of the book is that the way that, if there are institutional forms for that enterprise that I've just described as democracy, they will be electoral. That assumption may just be wrong. It may well be that, and this is where the economic comes back in, particularly in a context of severe economic inequality and transnational pressure on particularly the core elements of democratic constituencies, which is what we're seeing in both Europe and the United States. It's not possible to have electoral democracy that's sustainable. And in fact, the only kind of sustainable democracy would be one based upon sortition. One might take the path that Elaine Lansmore has taken, right? Completely plausible argument. Okay, but and we've just bracketed those. And I think it's a fair critique to say we just bracketed. But let's say, do I have another minute?
Yes.
Let's say that we accept the project of electoral democracy, if only for path-dependent reasons. We're on the path, we're stuck with it. We turned around and said, well, let's draw lots tomorrow. People would look at you like you're insane, right? I realize Helen's made that argument, David and Roybeck has made the argument. I actually think they're very good arguments. But let's assume that we are in the project of electoral democracy, and we are in a world of states where states operate through the provision of written texts that we call laws or constitutions or regulations, whatever they're called. In that world, it is very hard to imagine a project of democratic self-governance that adopts either no legal entrenchment or comprehensive legal entrenchment. Right? Why are the corner solutions out? Well, if everything is entrenched, if we know everything, if everything is settled at one point in time and nothing is capable of being changed, then we don't have revisibility, we don't have defeasibility. On the other hand, if we have nothing settled, if everything is always up for grabs, it is really hard to see how the ongoing project of self-rule, where you pick certain things, change those things, but then continue doing the other stuff that you've been doing, can take place. So you can't have complete determination by law, but you can't have no determination by law. So there's some space. That takes away the two corner solutions in which law is playing some role with respect to settling in a temporally persistent way rules of the game, as Trueblood nicely called them, so as to enable the project of democracy, which is necessarily, as I defined it, a project that extends over time. Within that space, I think this is where Tom's question comes from. Within that space, what do we learn from looking at the wealth of comparative experience around the world about the nature of the choices that we can make? Well, I would draw three conclusions that in very brief form about the nature of our learning. The first is, and this echoes something that Tarun said, is that we can at least be Hippocratic in our choices. We can at least avoid obvious errors that have proven time and time again to be errors, right? And it turns out that people are pretty bad at doing that. So as academics, if we can say, look, these are bad choices, that's important. Second, we can avoid false necessities. It's a mistake to think, in my view, that a court is a necessary institution for resolving certain kinds of disputes. So avoid false necessities. And then third, and I'll stop here, we can look across the spectrum of possible choices. We can think about the distribution of likely degrees of knavery in the world, to pick up on what Richard said. And we can think, well, how do we pick something that covers, it's not ever going to cover all of the distribution of possible knaveries, but we do our best to cover as much of it as possible. And that's hard, but at least I think we're making a little bit of progress on that. So sorry I went over.
Thank you.